Thanks, Marissa, and good morning, everybody. I'm Jane Hoppen. I'm a professor at NC State University and the lead investigator on the GenX Exposure Study. And we're going to tell you today a little bit about what we're doing in the GenX Exposure Study, and then really jump into what Dr. Nadine Kotlars, who's been a postdoc in my group for the past 3 years, has been working really hard to create this information. So, and thank you so much for joining us today. As Marissa said, we'd love to come see you, but we really felt like it was important to keep trying to get information out in a timely fashion as we went along. So just a reminder, since we've never had a meeting in Fayetteville before, the GenX Exposure Study is a research study that's funded by the National Institutes of Health, and it's led by investigators at NC State and ECU, and its partners in both Wilmington area and Fayetteville area. So there's a lot of other research projects that are happening in the community, and so our study is really focused on trying to answer 3 questions. Is GenX detectable in my body, in my house? What predicts GenX in my body, and are there health effects associated with GenX? And so I know that everybody wants to know the results of their blood samples, and we want to get you those as well. And we will as soon as the labs open up, but I just want to let you know we haven't forgotten about them. They are our highest priority as well, and we just have been unable to access the lab to finish that work. So we have not forgotten about them. So with that, we'll keep going on the next slide, Nadine. So just for those of you who are trying to keep track of all the different chemicals that are involved here, so we're interested in more than just GenX, because GenX is part of this family of chemicals known as PFAS, which are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And GenX in North Carolina is uniquely associated with the Fayetteville Works plant on the Cape Fear River. And GenX, along with other PFAS, have been released both to the air and water from the plant. And other byproducts of production include some more PFAS, including PFMOAA, Nathium byproduct 2, and others that we'll talk about more. But because this GenX is part of a broader class of chemicals, we also are measuring the legacy or historically used PFAS, such as PFOA and PFOS, which allow us to get an overall picture of PFAS exposure. So what do we do in Fayetteville? Well, in February 2019, we enrolled 153 participants, and we selected people based on well information, wells that have been previously tested for GenX by DEQ or Chemours. And we tried to sample about half the wells that exceeded the North Carolina Health Advisory of 140 parts per trillion, and half the people whose wells were below that. So that's how we determine what we call our sampling frame, just to get a wide range of exposure information. And we've collected well and tap water and analyzed those for PFAS, and we'll be talking about that today. We've also collected blood and urine samples for PFAS, and we're working on those. And we analyzed blood for clinical measures like thyroid and lipids. And for the participants in the study, you should have received those results from us a long time ago, but you should have those in your hands. Okay, next slide. So our Fayetteville cohort is characterized by people whose wells were sampled early on in the investigation of the contamination associated with the site. So it's not quite a circle because, as most of you know, the chemicals traveled through the air, and so that was kind of the sampling, the circle or ellipse that existed when we got started. So that's about the bounds. Because we're doing human subjects research, we're not putting individual people on a map without their consent. So So that's the area that we're talking about today is encompassed by this oval. So we enrolled 153 people, 137 of them were adults and 16 were children. We had 85 households, 14 from Bladen County and 71 from Cumberland. We enrolled up to 5 people per household, and we had about 44% of the people who enrolled in the study had lived at their address for more than 20 years. So long time of potential exposure related to drinking water. And then we have 17% that have lived at their house less than 5 years. So a good diversity in potential exposures. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Nadine Kotlars to talk about the well sampling and that aspect of the project. Thanks, Nadine.
Several wells surrounding the Fayetteville Works facility have been contaminated by PFAS, and this is likely how it happened. PFAS were released into the air from the facility. Wind transported those PFAS to areas around the facility, and those PFAS were deposited onto soil. When it rains, the rain will move the PFAS into the groundwater, and groundwater is the source of drinking water for private well users. In our study, we collected water samples from 84 unique wells in the area surrounding the Fayetteville Works facility. And in 82 of our participating homes, we were able to go inside and collect a tap water sample from their kitchen tap. We collected well samples because we wanted to understand the sources of PFAS exposure in the Fayetteville area, and we wanted to understand the role that contaminated well water played in PFAS exposure. We also wanted to look at other PFAS besides GenX in well water. In February 2019, when we did our sample collection at that time, most of the PFAS data on private wells was for GenX, but as Jane mentioned, there are several other PFAS that have been released from the Fayetteville Works facility, and so we really wanted to do a much broader analysis and look for several other PFAS in well water. We also collected tap water samples as part of our study because what comes out of the tap is what people are actually exposed to. Let's talk a little bit about some events that happened before we collected our water samples and some events that happened after we collected our water samples so we can put our sampling into context. In September 2017, Chemours stopped discharging processed wastewater that contained PFAS to the Cape Fear River. About this time, DEQ and Chemours started testing private wells for GenX. In May of 2018, Chemours took some initial steps to reduce air emissions from the Fayetteville Works facility using carbon. 9 months later, we were in the field collecting water samples from our participants' homes. We collected all of our water samples in the course of 4 days in February. Shortly afterward, the Chemours consent order was signed, and this is an agreement that stipulates actions that Chemours has to take to address the PFAS contamination, and we'll talk more about this consent order a bit later. In December 2019, Fayetteville Works began operating a thermal oxidizer to further reduce air emissions from the facility. And so it's important to realize that at the time of our sampling, there was likely still some ongoing air emissions from the Fayetteville Works facility. Our study follows a process to take a sample and produce results for our participants, and I wanted to give you an idea of what that process involves. we collected 166 water samples in the Fayetteville area, and a PhD student, Zach Hopkins at NC State University, developed a method that could be used to analyze those samples for PFAS. And we really prioritized a method that would be sensitive and specific for a large range of different PFAS. We analyzed those samples using this method, and then we reviewed the results for each PFAS chemical in each water sample. Once we have our results, we discuss it with our exposure study team, and they ask questions and we review the data and we become more familiar with what the data is telling us. Then we discuss the results with our Community Science Advisory Board, and this is a group of individuals from the Fayetteville area who help us to understand what is important about our results and what it means for the community, and also how do we talk about these results in a clear and easy to understand way. We drafted a letter that described our overall results, and our letters have to be reviewed by our institutional review board at NC State. Once they were reviewed, we sent letters to our participants that described our overall results, and we also gave them their individual results, and those letters were sent out in May 2020. So I'm going to tell you our overall findings. We have 5 overall findings from the water results, and then we'll talk about what we did and each finding in a little bit more detail. We found a wide range of GenX concentrations across the wells that we sampled in our study. And these concentrations ranged from wells that were non-detect for GenX, meaning we did not detect it in that water, to wells that were as high as roughly 920 nanograms per liter GenX. We found 10 other PFAS besides GenX in more than half of the wells that we sampled. With respect to the legacy PFAS, we found PFBA and PFPEA frequently across the wells we sampled. 2 other legacy PFAS, PFOA and PFOS, were detected in some wells, and these are important because they have health advisory levels, and we'll talk a bit more about that. Wells with higher GenX tended to have higher levels of the other PFAS. And overall, we found that taps where some form of home treatment was installed had, in general, lower levels of GenX than taps where there was no treatment, water treatment. So our method looked for 31 different PFAS in water, and I'm showing you a list of 13 PFAS that we looked for that are in North Carolina, unique to the Fayetteville Works facility. And this includes GenX, but several others. We also analyzed for legacy PFAS, and so these legacy PFAS have been used historically throughout North Carolina and in other parts of the United States. They are not strictly associated with the Fayetteville Works facility, although Fayetteville Works may contribute to some of these, and we'll talk a bit more about that. I'm going to focus on results for 13 PFAS, and the ones that I'm not focusing on are PFAS that we did not detect in wells or were rarely detected in wells. So what did we find in wells? We detected GenX in 70 of the wells we sampled in our study. And so this is a strip chart that shows you GenX concentrations for the wells we sampled. And this line is showing you concentrations of GenX in nanograms per liter, which is the same thing as parts per trillion. Each black circle is one well's GenX level. And so you can really see that there's quite a spread of different GenX levels across the wells. And this 2.5 is our method reporting limit for GenX, which means that if GenX was present in the wells at 2.5 nanograms per liter or greater, we would have been able to detect it, and we would have been able to determine how much was there. This yellow box represents the median GenX level across the wells, which was 103 nanograms per liter. And that means that half of the wells in our study had GenX greater than 103 nanograms per liter, and half of the wells in our study had GenX lower than 103 nanograms per liter. And this median value is helpful because it gives you a sense of the middle of the data, and we can use medians to compare across different PFAS. The red triangle is North Carolina's provisional health goal for GenX, which is 140 nanograms per liter. You may have heard this term before, provisional health goal or drinking water health advisory, and I wanted to take a minute and talk a little bit about what this number represents. So it is a concentration in drinking water in nanograms per liter. And the health goal for GenX was developed by the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. There are also health advisories for PFOA and PFOS at 70 nanograms per liter, which are from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. These levels are chosen based on current scientific research, and it is expected that at these levels or lower, no human health effects would be observed in the most sensitive people over a lifetime of exposure. It's important to realize that these levels are based on current research and are subject to change. There were 33 wells in our study that had GenX levels higher than the North Carolina provisional health goal of 140 nanograms per liter. If we look at just the median for GenX, so remember that it was roughly 100 nanograms per liter, we can compare medians with other PFAS that we observed in the wells. Here are other PFAS that we found in at least half of the wells in our study, and you can see that their median levels are lower than the GenX median level. There were two PFAS that we found at levels similar to, or in the case of PMPA, roughly 3 times higher than the GenX median in well water. Most of these PFAS are uniquely associated to the Fayetteville Works facility, with the exception of PFBA and PFPEA, which are considered to be legacy PFAS and may have also come from other sources. We detected PFOA and PFOS in some wells. We detected PFOA in 31 wells. None of our wells had PFOA greater than 70 nanograms per liter in February 2019. We detected PFOS in 20 wells, and 2 wells that we sampled had PFOS levels greater than the EPA health advisory of 70 nanograms per liter. Samples with higher GenX tended to have higher levels of other PFAS. I'm going to show this by highlighting 3 different samples from our study. So one sample in our study had about 900 nanograms per liter GenX. And you can see that it also had relatively high levels of these other PFAS. In another sample in our study that had about 100 nanograms per liter GenX, it had detectable levels of the other PFAS, but lower. In a third sample from our study that did not have detectable levels of GenX, we did not detect these other PFAS. And so these 3 examples just illustrate that the PFAS are correlated, which means that samples that were higher for GenX tended to have higher levels of other PFAS. So in summary from our well data, we observed a wide range of GenX concentrations across the wells. We found several other PFAS besides GenX in more than half of the wells. We observed some legacy PFAS in the wells. Importantly, PFBA and PFPEA were detected frequently, PFOA and PFOS detected in some wells, and wells with higher GenX tended to have higher levels of the other PFAS. So it's important to know that the current estimate is that about 3,000 private wells have been impacted by the Fayetteville Works emissions to date. Our study sampled 84 wells, and as Jane mentioned, this was not a random sampling because we were working off of a list of wells that had already been sampled by DEQ or ChemOrs. So it's important to realize that our well data tells us about our study participants' wells. It may not be representative of all of the contaminated wells surrounding Fayetteville Works. Let's switch and talk a little bit about what we found in taps. We collected a water sample from kitchen taps in 82 homes, and we collected the sample as is, which means that if the homeowner had installed any water treatment, the sample we collected from the tap would reflect that treatment. In February 2019, when we did our collection, most treatments were homeowner implemented. At that time, there were not many treatments in place that were installed by ChemOrs as part of the consent order. Most of the treatments that we were observing were homeowner implemented. 45 of the 82 homes had water treatment in February 2019. There were 32 homes where there was no treatment installed, and there were 4 homes where, when we went into the field to collect our samples, we discovered that the homes had been connected to a public water supply. And so we still collected a tap water sample from those homes. And there was one home that had a unique tap water supply. Let's talk a bit more about the types of treatments that we observed in the field. This is a diagram showing you a home that is receiving its water from a private well, and that well water is pumped to a tank. Some of the homes that we sampled from had a whole house water system, which means that the treatment is treating water used for bathing, showering, as well as water used for drinking. The different types of whole house treatment we observed were water softening, activated carbon, reverse osmosis, and in some cases we observed homes that had filters in place for particulate or sediment removal. Some homes had water treatment under the sink, and so this is a picture of an under the sink reverse osmosis system, and this would only treat the water that is used for drinking. We observed some activated carbon systems in the field and reverse osmosis systems in the field. Overall, what we observed is that treated taps had lower levels of GenX. So this figure is showing you the median GenX level for 32 homes that did not have treatment at the tap, and the median GenX level for 45 homes that did have treatment at the tap. And you can see that the GenX level, the median GenX level across homes with treatment is substantially lower. There was detectable GenX in the tap water from the 4 homes that were connected to public water. On average, this level was about 15 nanograms per liter. So overall, we have 5 findings from our water results. We observed a wide range of GenX concentrations in wells. We found 10 PFAS besides GenX in more than half of the wells. We observed some legacy PFAS in the wells. PFBA and PFPEA were detected frequently. PFOA and PFOS were detected in some wells. Wells with higher GenX tended to have higher levels of other PFAS. And overall, treated taps had lower levels of GenX than untreated taps. Let's take a minute to talk more about the ChemWars consent order. And so this is an order that requires ChemWars to reduce air emissions, remove PFAS from wastewater before discharge, and remove PFAS from contaminated groundwater. As part of this order, ChemWars also must provide filtration systems or public water for people with contaminated wells. Our study results do not qualify homeowners for ChemWars provided treatment under the consent order. If you would like additional well testing, you would need to contact DEQ to request that testing. What's next for our study? As Jane mentioned, we are anxious to continue and complete the blood analysis so that we can get those results to you. Right now, we've been delayed by COVID-19, and we are waiting for EPA labs to reopen so that we can get back to that work. We are continuing to analyze the results of our well and tap water sampling. We're interested in understanding why there's such a wide spread of GenX concentrations across wells. Currently, we don't know, but we'd like to evaluate what is driving that. We're also planning on combining the water results from the Fayetteville area with our water results from Wilmington, North Carolina, to put together a whole picture of how water quality has been impacted by emissions from Fayetteville works. And we will be analyzing the urine and other samples collected through the exposure study. You're muted, Jane.
All right, thanks, Nadine. And I just want to take a minute to let you know what's next. NC State received a grant from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, NIEHS, to create a Superfund center, which will allow us to look at human and environmental health impacts of PFAS. And for the GenX Exposure Study, it allows us to transition from an exposure study to a health study, and also to grow from 500 participants to 1,000. And we anticipate 400 people from the Fayetteville area and 600 from New Hanover and Brunswick County. So we're adding to our existing participants. Hope to increase minority recruitment and participation. And so what we're planning to do, and hopefully when North Carolina goes to phase 3, we'll hold a blood collection event and collect samples for PFAS, but also looking at thyroid hormones and the associated health implications. We're also trying to get a grant to see how PFAS may influence COVID response. So that would also be a part of that. So we're not enrolling people now, but we will soon. So stay tuned. That's like a coming event. And so something that hopefully we can generate some more information to help answer these questions. And this study is not just Nadine and I, it's many people, people at NC State, ECU, US EPA, our partners at New Hanover County Health Department and Cumberland County Health Department, Cape Fear River Watch, Sustainable Sandhills, and many others who have really helped advertise. So next slide. So but we can't do this without our study participants. And we also feel it's super important to try to get results out in a timely fashion. And so we encourage you to check our website, look at our newsletters, and we'll continue to hold these kinds of meetings. And so we're funded by a number of places. Again, here's our website. And I think we can go to the last slide here. So thanks for joining us. And particularly, we have a lot of people doing the work behind the scenes. Marissa and Cremona as our moderator, Claire Critchley, Adrian Wilkie, and Julian Kaplan are helping us keep organized. And I really encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box, and Marissa will be adding that to everybody, and I'll turn it back over to Marissa.
Great, thanks so much. So yeah, so we'll be shifting into the Q&A portion of the meeting, and we'll just take a few minutes. So there's a lot of information to listen to, and so send your questions to the chat box. And remember, everyone's going to be muted for this session, so the chat box and the Q&A are the best places to get your questions asked. And as just a reminder, this is going to be recorded and posted on our website. And so a rundown of our panelists. So we have Dr. Nadine Kotlars, we have Dr. Jane Hoppin, Detlef Kanapi is joining us as well, and Julie Woosley and Mercedes Hernandez from NCDEQ are also here to answer questions. So we'll take a few moments and just send us your questions through the chat box. Thank you. And so to kick us off with the Q&A, I just want to start off. Were any new or novel PFAS measured during this that weren't measured previously?
Thanks for that question, Marissa. We thought it made sense to start with this question because it seems to be something that's commonly asked. And so we did not detect anything that has not already been reported by US EPA in the lower Cape Fear River. So the PFAS that we detected in wells have been reported by EPA in the Cape Fear River, and what they observed was that either they were detected for the first time downstream of Fayetteville Works, or they increased substantially downstream of Fayetteville Works.
So we have another question. So my tap water levels were higher than my well water levels. Why did that happen?
So in some cases, tap water, your tap water GenX, for example, might have been higher than your well water GenX. And really, this is a question for the homes where there was no treatment in place, because you would expect those numbers to be pretty similar, right? So if your tap water measurement was higher than GenX, it was generally not higher by much. And this difference is related to the challenges of measuring for very low levels of chemicals in water. So we're measuring for nanograms per liter or parts per trillion in water. And so I find it helpful to make a comparison with money. So if one lucky person has a bank account with $1 trillion in it, and let's say we're talking about the difference between $95 and $75. 95 is still greater than 75, but both of them are pretty similar when you compare them to the overall $1 trillion in the account. So, just to summarize, if your tap water measurement was higher than your well water measurement, it generally wasn't substantially higher. And there might be some differences related to the challenges of measuring very low levels of these chemicals.
We have a question. What is Hydro-Eve? Can you explain that a bit more?
Hydro-Eve is a PFAS that has been associated with the Fayetteville Works facility. It was detected in the lower Cape Fear River by EPA, and it is structurally similar to Nafion byproduct 2, except that the sulfonate group is replaced by a carboxylic acid. So it's structurally similar to Nafion byproduct 2 and another byproduct of the processes at Fayetteville Works.
Great, thank you. Sorry, we're getting a few more questions. So this is kind of maybe more of a broad question, but will the level in my well change over time?
I think that's a good question, and it may. So the water samples that we collected in our study were collected at one point in time, and we have one well sample per well. So we don't have data to evaluate changes over time, but based on what we understand about groundwater is that it moves, and so it is possible that the levels in your well may change, and that could mean that if we did not detect GenX or other PFAS in February of 2019, we cannot say confidently that we wouldn't detect it in a few years. I think that this means that some monitoring of a subset of wells is going to be important to continue to do going into the future.
And this is a question about some of the filters. Do undersink systems typically incorporate activated carbon and RO filters?
Detlef might be a good person to answer this.
Okay, now, sorry, it took a little bit to unmute myself. Yeah, so the most common home filters for under the sink are reverse osmosis filters that incorporate both a reverse osmosis membrane and activated carbon filters. Also, there are other filters out there that are cheaper and are also for under the sink that include just activated carbon filters along with a sediment filter. The filters that we found in a study together with Duke University is that the under sink reverse osmosis filters are very effective in removing the PFAS from the tap water. Some of the other filters that are activated carbon based, like those that go into a refrigerator or onto a faucet or a Brita type filter, those have mixed results. They don't typically remove all of the PFAS, but they generally help lower the PFAS levels in the water that gets filtered.
Great, thank you. And this one, maybe the folks from DEQ would be able to provide some insight, but we have a question. Has public water been connected to Grays Creek schools?
I think you also need to help unmute.
Yes, let me know if you can hear me. This is Julie Woosley with the Department of Environmental Quality.
We can hear you, Julie. Thank you.
Great, thank you. At this time, no, the school has not been connected to public water. We have been talking to the local government there. They have been in conversations. I know that they are looking at plans to possibly do that. I do not think that that plan has been finalized or funded at this time.
Great, thank you. And another question potentially for Detlef, how far out have winds taken the chemicals?
So roughly about 10 miles out, there have been wells that have had detectable levels of PFAS. It's a little bit, the exact distance is a little bit hard to pin down. Some people measure from the center of the Kenmore's property, other people measure from the fence line. But also, I would argue that the outer boundary of how far PFAS are impacting wells around the site really hasn't been fully established yet.
Thank you. And as a follow-up to that, when will RO system installation get started up?
That goes to Julie.
To Julie, I apologize. Thanks, Jane.
You have to unmute her.
Thank you. That question was about when well testing, residential well testing will restart? Was that correct?
When will the RO system installation get started?
Okay, so at this time, RO installation has not started up again. And again, this goes back to concerns about having workers enter residence under the current phase related to coronavirus. So at this time, that has not started back up. But as soon as it is started back up, we will be letting the community know about that.
Julie, how are you going to let the community know? Will it be on your website? Are you going to, how will they know that it started back up?
So yes, in general, we have a website where we put this type of information. We also have community newsletters that we send out by email. We're actually preparing to send the most recent one by mail as well for folks who may not be able to get online during this time. In general, we'll send out, actually about this, I don't know that we'd send out a press release, but certainly we would communicate with leaders in the community to let them know. And again, this goes back to the consultant that does the RO systems and does the installation. They're the ones making that decision for when their workers will be going back out in the field. But we are communicating with Chemours about that and continuing to ask that question so that we will know when that starts back.
So another question, how do legacy chemicals interact with GenX and PFAS currently produced?
Sorry, I'm not sure what you mean by interact, but I can say a little bit about what our data is suggesting with respect to association. So we talked about 4 legacy PFAS, PFBA and PFPEA are 2 of them, and were highly associated with GenX in the wells. PFOA and PFOS, based on our data, were not. In terms of interactions, we can tell that 2 of them are associated with GenX and 2 of them were not. Not sure if that was the intention of the question.
Okay, great, yeah. And if it wasn't, please just put it back in the QA box and we'll get to it. Thank you. There's a question about, would water softeners accumulate PFAS in them?
Yeah, I'll give that one a shot. I would say no. We have sampled in the Wilmington area several water softeners and found that the water going into those water softeners and the water leaving those water softeners had very similar levels, similar to what Nadine described. If you take 10 samples, they won't be exactly the same number. The influent may be a few parts per trillion higher in some and a few parts per trillion lower in others. But that's just the random variability of the measurements that we're conducting.
This is Julie Woosley again. I do just want to mention we did find one home where there were significantly higher GenX levels after a water softener than before, but this was a system that had not been maintained in many years, and we were able to have it maintained and cleaned out, and then that was no longer the case.
And so this one is also for Julie. And I believe it's also in the chat, so I may mess up these. Try to read as best as possible. But will SS 143-215-2A be enforced now that Chemours has gotten a notice of violation?
I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I do know that DEQ put out a notice that they are looking into potential enforcement related to some soil disposal from the facility that happened recently. I can't speak to exactly what that will look like. I'm not part of that discussion.
Thank you. So we have a question. I believe this is about the GenX study recruitment, but how will you announce for individuals to be part of the health study and when?
So, well, I can let you know that we're not going to be able to be in the field until North Carolina goes into phase 3, which means we won't be able to advertise until we know that that's happening. So, and I don't mean to be coy, but part of our recruitment plan needs to be reviewed and approved by our human subjects committee before we can advertise recruitment. But I'm hoping that we get to phase 3 in the fall and that we can recruit people then. And I would suggest to follow our website and all the various channels. And when we have approved plan, we can go forward with that. So, but we will try to expand so that we can capture, now that we know that there's wells that have been contaminated, I think up to 16 kilometers from the plant. So it'll be a pretty big sampling frame of people who might be eligible. I think there was also a question about how to get your blood analyzed for PFAS. And so there's a list of 3 laboratories that DEQ has identified that are able to analyze blood for PFAS. Some of them will take 1 sample and send you a result, and others need to be part of a larger protocol. But if you email the study email, we can email you that list, and you can see what you can learn from there.
Great, thank you. And so we have a question about, does GenX affect pH or iron levels in the well?
Detlef.
Okay. Took again a little bit to unmute. The answer to that is no. The levels of the PFAS are really very low in the context of making a change in the pH of the water. What we have noticed with some of the water that we have sampled from around the area is that the pH is apparently naturally quite low, and that is something we are quite interested in and want to follow up on. In my research group, we have a study that is ongoing where we are planning to sample 30 homes from the Fayetteville area, and we will focus on the pH question among other things in that study.
And this is probably also best for you, Detlef. Was it found that certain home water filtration systems were more effective than others?
Yes, so I'm going to follow up on some of the things I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to answer the question in the context of home filters that are available for purchase on either at your favorite home improvement store or online. And I'm going to focus just on the under the sink or tap water type of filters, not the whole house filters. The most effective type of filter for under the sink is a reverse osmosis filter. Their cost is on the order of $200 to $300 and can be installed relatively easily. Also do it yourself, but those are the filters that are also being installed as part of the consent order if homes are in the 10 to 70 nanogram per liter total PFAS range. Other filters that are effective are what we call two-stage under the sink filters. They have a cartridge with a sediment filter followed by a cartridge with an activated carbon block filter. They cost on the order of $100 and would also be installed under the sink. Those filters would have to be changed out every 3 to 6 months. A set of filters costs about $20. Those are also very effective for PFAS removal. Other types of filters like refrigerator filters or Brita filters, or the type that you can install at the tap, are partially effective. So they help remove PFAS, but they don't completely remove PFAS. So I'm going to leave it at that. If there are follow-up questions, please type them in, and I'm happy to say a little bit more.
So Dale, if there was a question, low pH is acidic, correct?
That's correct.
Correct. And all these PFAS are acids, right?
That's also correct.
So
yeah, so I understand the concern, but if I add, a nanogram per liter or 70 nanograms per liter or even 1,000 nanograms per liter of acid to a natural water, like the PFAS, it will have essentially no effect on the pH. I think, there are other potential reasons why the pH in the area is low, but I think that is what needs to be investigated, whether that is related to the local geology in the area or whether it is related to other emissions from the plant that could have led to the rainwater being more acidic than what it would naturally be.
And Detlef, we have a follow-up too. How effective are whole house filters? Could you talk more about those?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I'm going to begin answering that with the type of whole house filters that are being installed as part of the consent order. And those filters are, they contain a very large amount of activated carbon. And as a result of that, they are very effective for removing PFAS. I understand there are some other potential operational issues with these filters in terms of clogging or in terms of water pressure in the home. But if we stick with just their effectiveness for PFAS removal, they are very effective. If you purchase a whole house filter outside of this Chemours program, I'm actually quite hesitant in terms of recommending those, because the ones that we have looked at in Wilmington area and also Heather Stapleton's group in the Triangle area, they really have been of mixed effectiveness at best. Some, achieve partial removal of PFAS, some almost none. And the challenge with whole house filters is that often they contain a proprietary mix of filter materials, and not all of them are really designed to remove PFAS. Also, there are whole house reverse osmosis units available, but there are several concerns I have with those. For one, they may overload your septic system, because you would actually pull out a lot more water from your well to pass through this RO unit, and a lot of that water would get rejected and would have to be considered wastewater. And the other is that RO treatment can increase the corrosivity of the water, which means your indoor plumbing may corrode more quickly, and you may have problems with metals in your water. So I would be very cautious with whole house filters, other than the type that is part of the consent order program.
Great, thank you. And so just doing a time check. So it's now noon. So if you do have to hop off, just as a reminder, this is going to be recorded and posted on our website. And so we'll be taking questions for about another 20 minutes or so before our session time's out. So please continue to put them in the Q&A box. And so we have a general question too. Is GenX a PFAS or a standalone issue? Can we talk more about that broadly?
So GenX is part of this family of chemicals known as PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, that are broadly used to make nonstick and water repellent products. And so we're focusing on GenX because it was really the first chemical that raised all the attention around this PFAS contamination. But as we learned more, we also identified, as Nadine pointed out, there were 11 chemicals that were detected very frequently. And so these PFAS are all part of the overall picture of what chemicals people are being exposed to from the well water there. So other parts of the United States have different problems with PFAS depending on the source of the exposure. How do the results compare to water results from around the country? I don't know. I think that's one of the things that we're going to try to look at. So many of the chemicals that we have detected aren't measured in haven't been found in other parts of the country. So it's hard to compare there. And there's not a good national data set on groundwater levels of these chemicals.
And we have a question. Do we know how PFAS or GenX affect vegetables grown near the Chemours plant?
So there is an ongoing study at NC State that is part of the PFAS testing network. And we also have an EPA-funded study on this question. And so at this point, we do not have really sufficient information to answer this question well. But it is something that we're trying to answer as part of these ongoing studies. And we will include different types of plants, including root vegetables and leafy plants and fruits. We also have some food items, fruits and vegetables that were grown in the area by homeowners in the Fayetteville area, and we are in the process of analyzing those. Again, we're kind of stuck right now because of the COVID situation. This is actually a pretty challenging task. Before we are able to run these samples, we need to have a method that allows us to generate results that we can be confident in. And that's been really the challenging part with this activity.
Thank you. And we have a clarification question. So there's lots of different names for GenX, HFPODA, long chemical names, etc. Are they all the same?
Once it is in water, I would say yes. There are subtle distinctions between GenX and HFPODA and the 902 and the 903 compounds. But once they're in water, they're all the same. So, it's a little bit challenging when people get reports back from different laboratories or reviewing data. And some lab might report GenX and another lab might report HFPODA. But they're really all the same thing for practical purposes.
Great, thank you. And going back to some questions that are outside the scope of our study, but if there's any insights we can share with people, we have some questions about should we be concerned about pets or are livestock and food source animals being tested for PFAS?
So I don't know that we know a lot of answers to these questions. I know that there are researchers who are trying to get studies going to look at PFAS exposure in companion animals such as cats and dogs. And I don't know who is looking at impacts to livestock, but I think that those are all questions that are really important to understand because clearly we're all impacted at some level by these chemicals. And so I think there's ongoing research. It's not what we're doing, but we're trying to, other researchers have reached out to us. And so, so we may be able to let people know about those studies as they become available.
And this is a question for Julie. Has adoption of EPA Health Advisory STD for PFOA, PFOS as NC groundwater standard gone out for public comment?
So that standard was reviewed by the Science Advisory Board, and then we'll go back to the EMC for final adoption. I was just looking to see when the public comment, I believe the public comment period has ended, but I'm going to have to get back to you once I find dates on that. It may not have started too, so don't hold me to that. I'm looking now.
Julie, can you say what EMC means?
I apologize. Sure. It's the Environmental Management Commission. So this is the rulemaking body that oversees rulemaking related to environmental issues. So any changes to the rules in the state of North Carolina go before the EMC. And sometimes when they have specific science questions, they might make a request of this Governor's Science Advisory Board to review different standards, look at the latest scientific information, and then make a recommendation back to the EMC.
Great, thank you. And I think this is also another question for you, Julie. Is the whole home GAC system installation on hold because of COVID?
Yes, that work is also on hold. Again, there are multiple groups involved here in terms of Parsons is the entity that puts those in. But as you know, the well testing has restarted in the area because that is something that the contractors can do outside wearing appropriate PPE and not have to worry about potentially exposing any residents. So they are looking for options for when they will be able to start back with GAC installation, but that is not happening at this time.
Thank you. And this probably also goes to you, Julie. Has anyone looked at the effect of home sales in exposed areas?
That would not be something that DEQ would do. That's not in our wheelhouse. I'm not sure who might do a study like that.
And I don't know of anyone who is formally doing that, but that would be an important question to answer.
All right. So I'm just going to start closing it out here. If you have any follow-up questions for our study specifically, or if we can help you get some more information, please send it to our email up on the slide there, at genx-exposure-study@ncsu.edu. And thank you so much for joining us. This is, like we said, this was a different kind of meeting for all of us. And this was our first attempt, so we really appreciate your patience as we figured it out. And like, if you have any recommendations or comments on how we can improve, also send us an email and let us know. And we're just going to try and keep getting better and better at this. And hopefully we can see you all in the field soon. And keep checking our website for more study updates. And thank you so much again. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. And thank you to all of our panelists for taking the time to come out and answer some questions as well. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great day, you guys.
For joining.
And thanks, Julie and Mercedes, for being here to help us out.
You're welcome. Have a good day.
Thanks. Oh, good. Mike said 67. Okay.